Hello, this is Sina Toossi. I'm a senior research analyst at the National Iranian American Council, and today I'm going to answer a few questions on the ongoing negotiations in Vienna over restoring the Iran nuclear deal and what the possible restoration of the deal could mean for the region at large. Now, the Iran nuclear deal, which is formerly known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the JCPOA, was a landmark agreement in nuclear nonproliferation. It imposed the most significant restrictions on a country's nuclear program that have ever been successfully negotiated in the history of nuclear nonproliferation. It also created a model for US-Iran diplomacy and put the longtime adversaries on the path to broader dialogue. However, the Trump administration squandered the JCPOA's gains, reneged on the deal, and opted for a maximum pressure campaign to exert severe economic and other forms of pressure on Iran. In the end, maximum pressure did not elicit new concessions from Iran or collapse the Iranian government. Instead, it resulted in a massively expanded Iranian nuclear program without the JCPOA's constraints, far more regional instability, created massive human suffering inside Iran, and took the US and Iran to the brink of a catastrophic war on multiple times. President Biden is now set to reverse course on Trump's failed approach and re-enter the JCPOA. Now, the JCPOA is a ready-made solution to the Iran nuclear crisis, and a return to the deal can begin the process of de-escalating sky-high US-Iran tensions and set the region as a whole towards a more peaceful direction. But the US and Iran right now are at a fork in the road. If the JCPOA talks in Vienna right now fall through, escalation will once again become the name of the game. If a return to the JCPOA doesn't materialize, the prospects for diplomacy will rapidly fade. And as each side sticks to the pressure track and escalates, conflict will increasingly become inevitable. The negotiations that led to the JCPOA in the first place and the eventual deal were strongly opposed by powerful forces in the US, Iran, and the region. In Israel, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu made himself the poster boy of opposition to the negotiations and the JCPOA. He made common cause with Republicans in the US trying to sabotage US-Iran diplomacy and, ironically, with hardliners in Iran. Now, what binds Iranian hardliners, the Israeli hard right, and hawks in America is their shared aversion to any improvement in relations between Iran and the West. Each, for their own reasons, views détente between the US and Iran as coming at the expense of their interests. And as such, each of these forces has done everything in their power to prevent the JCPOA and successful de-escalation of tensions between the US and Iran. In recent weeks, as these Vienna talks have made progress, we've seen hawks in the US Congress introduce poison pill provisions in legislation to tank prospects for US-Iran diplomacy. We've seen Israel blow up nuclear facilities in Iran in a clear attempt to create a new escalation cycle. And we've seen Iranian hardliners dramatically stepping up their attacks on the moderate President Rouhani and his foreign minister Javad Zarif, and framing them as traitors and duped by America. Now, what's kept the Vienna talks going is political will from Iran at the US at the highest levels. Both President Biden in Washington and Rouhani and Ayatollah Khamenei in Iran support a compliance for compliance return to the JCPOA and have given their diplomats in Vienna the backing they need for these talks. This is what enabled the deal to be reached in 2015 as well, with President Obama at the time ignoring attacks from Netanyahu and Republicans and seeing the negotiations through until the end. Now, as long as this political will exists from the top decision makers in Washington and Tehran, the prospects for the JCPOA's restoration in these talks in Vienna are good. A return to the JCPOA will not only lift the debilitating economic sanctions on Iran and put the lid on the Iranian nuclear program, but it will also create the possibility for a new regional order centered on diplomatic solutions to conflicts and increased dialogue between Iran, Saudi Arabia, and other regional powers. For decades, the US has sought to transform the Middle East and consolidate a US-led regional order undergirded by massive US military presence and alliances with a host of Arab dictatorships in Israel. This policy reached its zenith under the Trump administration, with the US giving unconditional support to Israel, the Saudis, the Emiratis, and their objectives of squashing Iran and its regional influence, expanding the devastating war on Yemen, trying to bend Qatar to their will, and crushing their other perceived external and internal threats. Now, Trump's approach, in fact, exacerbated a classic moral hazard problem with respect to these traditional US allies. These states have engaged in more and more destabilizing and aggressive actions with the belief that the US is going to back them no matter what. Now, the result was a more destabilized region, expanded conflicts, and blowback and quagmire for America's traditional allies in the region on all fronts. These regimes are arguably in a more strategically vulnerable position after 3 years of maximum pressure against Iran. And now, the actions of the US have a clear forecast for them, that the US seeks to reduce its regional presence and get out of the escalation track with Iran. Now, America re-entering the JCPOA and opening lines of communication with Tehran can incentivize its traditional regional partners to do more to curry US favor and come to terms with Iran themselves. Already, when these states realized the limits of US support after Iranian attacks against them during the Trump era, they moved towards diplomacy and reaching a modus vivendi with Tehran. There are signs of this process expanding in recent weeks, with reports of high-level talks between Iran and Saudi Arabia and other regional states. Now, the JCPOA presents a historic opportunity for a new strategic landscape to emerge in the region, one based off the US playing a balancer role in communicating with all sides, and Iran and the GCC countries moving away from a zero-sum view of each other's regional influence and accommodating each other's interests. All sides have an interest in ending various long-running and costly conflicts in the region, and a return to the JCPOA will be the critical prerequisite required for such regional dialogue and establishing a more stable regional balance of power.